Well, I think we will go ahead and get ready to kick things off here. I know, like I said, it usually takes a few extra minutes for people to kind of stroll into our Zoom world, if you will. So welcome to another TPMA webinar. Hopefully we have some returning visitors that are joining us today, but just in case there are not, the webinar that you are joining today is part of our pandemic recovery series that we have been operating since around March. We have covered a number of topics ranging from workforce to economic development, education, and everything in between related to pandemic recovery. So today is a long-awaited webinar involving those who are justice involved in the workforce initiatives surrounding that particular population. My name is Andrea Hutchins. I am Vice President at Thomas P. Miller & Associates and have the distinct honor of getting to lead the majority of these webinars, but not all. We have some really great staff members who definitely dive in and do a great job of this as well. But really glad and excited to be surrounded by such talented folks with us here today. So momentarily, I am going to allow them to introduce themselves and tell a little bit about not only their professional backgrounds, but also their organization. Before I do, I want to give a couple of housekeeping items to our audience members. One, this is being recorded. We often get asked if people can come back and listen to pointers and pieces of the webinar at a future date. And yes, you can. We do keep these on our YouTube page. They are also emailed out to you post webinar. And if there are other resources that are mentioned during the webinar from any of our guests and our panelists, we are happy to provide those resources as part of a follow-up email as well. One other just quick item, we do take questions from the audience, but to ensure that we can get through all of the questions that we have planned for today, I generally don't begin answering those questions until we hit about the midway point. So we should be done at about an hour. If there is a really exciting conversation going on, we may go a few minutes over, but we're generally pretty concerned with getting you all in and out at a reasonable time. So I think we will just go ahead and kind of go around the horn and allow just a few minutes to introduce our panelists and have them tell just a little bit about their professional experience as it relates to the justice involved, as well as their organization. And I'm going to start off with Miss Artie Finn. Artie, would you like to start us off today?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So welcome, everyone. I'm Artie Finn. I am the co-founder and chief business development officer of APDS. APDS, in a nutshell, prepares justice-involved individuals for success in life. And what we mean by that is we provide pathways to individualized education, rehabilitation, job training, and reentry plans. We also have hardware and a platform that we deliver into correctional institutions as well as into parole and probation. And then we also have data. So we're firm believers that data drives outcomes. So we provide access to how much time somebody spent, so effort, and then outcome. And that's the data we share. While we are a tech company, we know tech alone doesn't solve all problems. So we are firm believers in teachers and program staff. So we partner where we can with our institutions who are our clients, as well as institutions of higher ed, like some of the ones that will be discussed today. Our approach is that we pay. So our jurisdictions pay for our solution. We never charge anyone involved in the criminal justice system for our solution. We are now, I think, in 19 states and over 100 institutions. And we look forward to being part of this discussion.
Excellent. Well, thank you for being here, Artie. All right. I think we will go ahead and hand things over to Jeff Scott. I believe you go by Jeff and not Jeffrey, so hopefully I didn't mess that up.
I go by with whatever usually people call me. So I am honored to be here today. It's great to see Kylie and Artie again. My name is Jeff Scott. I'm the chancellor for the Ivy Tech Community College, Muncie and Henry County campus. My career started many years ago, back in the mid-'80s, as a probation officer in Grant County, and worked in that field for a number of years. And in many ways, that field is still a passion of mine. Worked as a number of years as a chief probation officer, began teaching at Ivy Tech as an adjunct instructor back in 2001. And since that time, have become a full-time criminal justice human service department chair, associate professor, became a dean, vice chancellor of academic affairs for a period of time, and then chancellor, which will be 4 years this November. And so I've really loved being a part of a community college, engaging with our communities, trying to make sure that we give folks a pathway to a better life. Oftentimes that's working with students and areas that haven't had as much success in the past or has had some challenges. So we're really the bridge to hopefully a better life and a better pathway. And so excited to be involved in this panel today to try to answer any questions, to present some of the things we're doing, and work with Kylie and Artie in trying to assist everybody that's out there. I am not used to doing paneling virtually. I'm usually up like being in front of a room, so I will try to resist getting up and moving around and making you dizzy on the screen. And I'm usually very animated with my hands, so I'm trying to sit on those as being as calm as possible, which is a challenge. So thank you for having me here.
I was going to say, you told on yourself. We would never have been able to have told. So you're doing good already. All right. Thanks for being here with us, Jeff. All right. How about you, Kylie?
Hi, everyone. I am so excited to be here. I love talking with folks that are experts in their fields, and these two have certainly been doing this work for a long time. So I'm excited to have a conversation with them and share some of my own insights as well. I started working with the reentry population when I was working at a community center on the Near East Side of Indianapolis, which is an area with a really high population of folks that are returning from corrections every year, or just simply folks that have a criminal history who need additional support. At the time that I was working there, they had been a subrecipient of a Department of Labor grant called Reentry Employment Opportunities. So I was helping facilitate the administration of that grant through case management and getting clients employed that way. And they continue to be a second chance grantee from the Department of Justice. At the role I have now at TPMA, one of my biggest projects is as one-stop operator, continuing in Indianapolis, Indiana, and two of our RIOA partners are second chance grantees from the Department of Justice as well. So I continue to try to be knowledgeable about corrections and the reentry space. In 2018, I did obtain a certification as an offender workforce development specialist. That is a curriculum developed between the National Institute of Corrections and the National Career Development Association, and was delivered by the Indiana Department of Corrections. So I try to stay up to date on what's happening in all of those spaces so we can continue to be the most helpful for the communities that we're working with, and being able to tap into this particular pool of talent, which can be a little challenging, but very rewarding.
Absolutely. Well, I think that could be the whole theme for having this particular webinar today, Kylie, which is, this is a very challenging, issue for many of our communities. It's kind of been an oft forgot population that I think that the pandemic, and again, going back to our pandemic recovery series, has really kind of shone a light on. So a little bit of background on myself. I noticed at the beginning, I mentioned, I get to host these webinars and I do a lot of moderating when it comes to these webinars. But for this one in particular, I have to tell you, it's a little bit more near and dear to my heart than maybe some of the others that I have participated in. And that's because I'm from Leavenworth, Kansas. And for those of you who know, Leavenworth is technically the prison capital of the country. So I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but my dad is actually retired federal prison employee. And so when I took over as the economic development director in Leavenworth, one of the first things that we started trying to take on was making sure that those individuals who were actually released into the community had, the economic tools in order to get workforce education, training, that the businesses were prepared for those type of employees, et cetera. And so, for communities who are used to that type of thing and used to dealing with these populations, that's a much easier progression or, trajectory. But for a lot of communities across the country, it's, like I said, it's an oft overlooked population that I think we're starting to realize are going to need a little bit of additional assistance in order to thrive. So that brings me to my first question today. So, recently we've seen an unprecedented level of economic investment into our local communities, obviously with the American Rescue Plan Act, CARES funds, et cetera. As communities begin to design and implement initiatives specific to this population, why is it important to consider the justice-involved population? And so I'm going to go ahead and start off with you, Artie, since you went first, if you don't mind.
I don't mind, sorry. I think we have to understand as a country, 1 out of every 31 adults is somehow involved in the criminal justice system. It gets worse when you start to look at minority populations. 1 out of every 3 African Americans and 1 out of every 6 Hispanics are involved. And so when you start to think about the people who are left out of the employment process and the recidivism rates in this country, we have a national recidivism rate of 43%. And in some states, it's as high as 80%. And you look at the people, I was fortunate to be in Indiana about a month ago and talking to a small town sheriff who told me the story of how he uses his jail to keep people clean and to support them the best he can. But he runs a very small jail with very limited resources. And he said, the one thing that helps people stay out of jail is a job. And not just any job, a living wage job. And so when you start to think about the population and the challenges they have to employment, pathways to employment, you really start to understand the scope and scale of this problem. There are 2.2 million people incarcerated, another 11.5 million people on parole, probation, alternatives to incarceration. The numbers are staggering. We cannot afford as a country to leave those people behind.
Well, and not only can we not afford it, obviously right now businesses are clamoring for qualified workforce. And so we also know that a job is one of those things that positively impacts the recidivism rate. So that's a great point, Artie. And some of those statistics are just insane. So Jeff, how about you? Do you have anything that you would like to add to that particular question?
Yeah, not only is job is what helps reduce recidivism, but we know from research that education reduces recidivism. In fact, it's the one consistent across the board that every level of educational attainment has a drastic reduction on recidivism. So it's a matter of combining that job, that training, that education in a high wage in demand field, because we have to remember that, the justice involved community is wide ranging. It's not only the ones that are coming back from prison after serving a sentence through reentry, but it can be pretrial supervision of somebody who was brought into the system because the criminal, DUI went from 0.10 to 0.08. And so it brings additional people into the criminal justice system. And so it can be on a pretrial release. It can be on community supervision. And so as we're looking at filling pipelines, it's important to keep in mind that it's not only the reentry, but it's pretrial. It's folks who are on probation. It's folks who are involved in community corrections. It's folks that are in pretrial in jail, which a lot of our local jails are pretrial, are housed there, pending a determination of their criminal justice case. And so there's a huge pool there that we can work together to try to find not only the education, but then meaningful employment after that training.
Absolutely. And great point, Jeff. I definitely did not want to leave out education as being part of that positive impact on the recidivism. So all good points. Kylie, how about you, especially from a workforce perspective? And you're on mute. I see you're getting ready to talk. So I just...
Thank you.
Yes.
From a workforce and economic development standpoint, this is a population that just typically is unemployed at a much higher rate than your typical population. Depending on what data you're looking at, it can range from 25% unemployment up to 60 or 70%. So really it's going to depend on the community, what kinds of jobs people are able to get access to, et cetera. It's also a pretty big economic issue. Not only does it cost money to have to put people into correctional systems because those systems are expensive. But then those folks aren't earning money and returning those investments into their communities economically. They're not spending, they're not earning, they're not paying taxes, et cetera. And the last thing I think is important for communities to consider is when they're trying to attract and retain new talent, community safety is a huge part of what makes someone want to live in a place. And so we have to have ways and strategies to get ahead of this, to be able to create more opportunities for citizens who are returning, to get them educated, employed, and housed, making them less likely to return to prison and less likely to commit crimes in the communities that they're living in.
Absolutely. Thank you, Kylie. Definitely some good food for thought. And actually, I'll give you some time to think about this one, Kylie, but I think especially what you're saying is going to add a lot of additional impact into our next question. So many workforce practitioners and nonprofits continue to struggle with connecting the justice-involved population to sustainable employment opportunities, sustainable being the key, and that really is what impacts recidivism. What strategies and partnerships are needed to overcome this particular obstacle? So Artie, if you don't mind, we'll go ahead and kick off with you. And I know, Kylie, you'll have some additional things to bring up the rear, but that was a great segue.
I think from our perspective, reentry has to start at the point of involvement with the criminal justice system. So as Jeff highlighted, what we really need to do is start to assess somebody at the beginning of their involvement, determine what their needs are, and then meet those needs across a variety of areas. And you really need to, education is a key piece. Is somebody going into a post-secondary pathway? Is somebody going into a vocational pathway? Do they have a high school equivalency or a high school diploma? Because those are all keys, not only to employment, but also to high wage employment. Then you need to look at the rehabilitation piece, right? So you need to understand what is the mindset that led to this and how do we help support that? Jeff and I have had conversations about that piece as being critical. The third piece is the certifications. You know, when you can give somebody a certification, you give an employer an assurance that they are skilled enough to understand what they need to do. So if we can create those pathways, starting at the point of whether it's incarceration or, as Jeff noted, you're a detainee and you haven't even been sentenced. There's a reason, I don't think people think of this, but even 24 hours of incarceration, even in a jail, means you're likely to lose your job, right? You don't show up for work, you don't keep that job. And so we have to start to create and think about people at the beginning of their involvement in the system.
Absolutely, Artie. And, when you look at taking somebody from point A to point B, that really does involve working with a lot of different types of organizations, right? So organizations like Ivy Tech. So Jeff, I'm going to pick on you just a little bit now and ask you specifically what strategies and partnerships are needed kind of to build on what Artie said in order to do what she's suggesting, taking that individual from point A to point B.
It's got to involve the full spectrum. And often we work around here right now on a concept of prospect profession, working on the recruiting and on the tail end, because it's important to keep in mind it's much more cost effective to educate than to incarcerate. Yeah. And so as we're looking at, the things that we need to do, it takes collaboration, and sometimes it takes getting rid of egos and worrying about who gets credit and just worry about doing what is right and helping to build up our communities, particularly working into the communities that are justice involved or some of the neighborhoods or the areas that, are struggling. And a lot of that's got to be built, on a foundation of trust. And so as we look at what honest discussion that needs to be had, sometimes it's if somebody has had some issues in a particular area that they're not going to get a job in early childhood education, or they're not going to get a job in healthcare, is to really have that honest discussion about what opportunities there are. Because we know that skill training in welding or robotics or some of the other advanced manufacturing fields are very high wage and in demand, jobs right now. We in our area, just in our county, there are 1,000 vacancies in advanced manufacturing, and we only have, 246 people, that are in our advanced manufacturing pipeline right now. So it's just vital that, we strategize and bring people in and educate what opportunities there are for them, and then provide them those pathways that they can get the skill set, they can get the training and the certifications, and then partner them with companies that we know are also supportive to work with that population and to provide that additional wraparound support in an industry that will help people be successful.
Jeff, real quick, I do want to ask you just a short follow-on question. So one of the things that you just mentioned was working with companies and having those companies who are kind of already, I don't want to say vetted, but they know the process, they know what it is that they're getting, they know the type of population that they're dealing with, and often they have programs set up to do that. How do you find those companies? Do they come to you, or do you seek them out?
Yeah. About 6 months ago, we had a group of employers reach out to us because of trying to find a workforce. And we've kind of designated that as called a Work Matters. And we're meeting monthly on strategies to build pipelines and to work with folks and to get people in their door, because they understand the times are over of being as picky as you once were, and having people knock down your door because they need a job. It's like I tell folks who are applying here, I know they're interviewing us as much as we're interviewing them, and so finding willing partners who know that they need a strong workforce of folks to be able to be viable and to have their company grow. And so really it's kind of helping them understand that culture is important. Building relationship is important. It's more than just a supervisor handing out paychecks on a Friday. It's really understanding what trials and tribulations that folks are going through. And once they can build that connectivity and they build that brand and that loyalty, then folks will change some of their patterns. And if, it's like I tell folks, if we can get people into a work environment and changing some decisions for 90 days to 6 months, and that becomes more of a habit for them. And they can build some more long-term sustainability with that industry partner.
And
go ahead, Artie.
I just want to add one thing to that, because I think from the employer perspective, and this is for those that are reluctant to hire, we create transcripts because we really believe you need to see the whole person. And so when you just look at somebody's resume and you see gaps, or you don't see a traditional resume as you would see, a transcript gives you a different view into someone. And so from an employer perspective, if you can see, here's the effort put in, here's the outcomes achieved, and here's the recommendations from the folks that worked with this person, it's a totally different conversation.
Absolutely. Well, it really sounds like there is kind of a niche area that's starting to bubble up out of all this, which is really kind of employer-led, right? Like bringing everyone together. I mean, employer-led is often the most successful, but I think especially for those attendees in TPMA's world, most of our audience members are government employees, educators, workforce boards, et cetera. So these are, I'm sure, really good ideas for them to help get the business community more involved. Kylie, before I have you answer that question really quickly, I just want to let everyone know I do see the questions that are coming in, and they are very much appreciated. We're going to give Kylie the opportunity to respond to this question briefly, and then we'll go ahead and start addressing some of the questions coming from the audience. So Kylie, what are your thoughts on strategic partnerships?
Yeah, so thankfully the panelists already covered two of the three things I was going to mention, which were early interventions. Really, the faster that you can get someone connected to programming while they're in facility or services once they're reentering, the better and the more helpful that's going to be in getting these folks connected to sustainable employment opportunities. They need the paycheck today and not in 3 months when they're already going to be behind on things like rent and paying their fees from corrections, et cetera. So early intervention is definitely one of the first strategies that I think is the most important. And another one was close relationships with employers. And since I know we're going to continue talking about that, I won't go too much into that. But I do think that employers can consider their relationships with community-based organizations and nonprofits to be very valuable in helping them retain talent because those folks understand the types of barriers that these folks are facing. So you may not understand why someone is going to be 30 minutes late for work every day or has to leave for 1 hour every couple of weeks to meet with a probation officer. But when you're working with a case manager or someone else who's working with this individual, you two can share information to make sure that you really are getting the whole picture of this person's situation. It's going to make them a better employee in the long run and more likely to stay with you as well. And then wraparound supports, another big one. So really looking at the person as a whole, understanding that yes, they need employment, yes, they need education, but they also need a place to stay that's going to be safe and keep them away from the types of influences that might have gotten them into trouble in the past. About getting folks financially literate so that they're able to manage money and finances better so that they can get themselves out of the types of economic situations that cause stress and put people into other kinds of situations. And then things like transportation barriers, all that kind of stuff has to be considered as a strategy for the nonprofits and workforce practitioners to consider when we're trying to connect these folks to employment.
And I would just add an ID. You would not think that an ID is so important, but folks who are involved in the criminal justice system have a very hard time regaining their identification.
Those are the little things, Artie, that I think are oft overlooked, right?
Yes.
Yeah, we take those things for granted. So for sure. Well, thank you all. So we're going to briefly switch over and go to some of the questions coming in from the audience. We'll do this a little bit differently. All three of you do not have to answer these questions, so that way we can make sure that we stick to the hour time frame. So Ken Carroll has asked a couple of questions. If you want to interject, feel free. This first one, I think we're going to direct to Jeff, and then I think Artie, you might have some things to say as well. So are there any good examples of offenders receiving college credit for their successful completion of private sector online instruction programs? So Jeff, we're going to let you kick that one off.
I'm not sure, specifics of that. I know, we have some examples that we're working. Indiana went from, inmates being able to get different education. Now, whether that education was viable or not post-release was always a challenge, and whether it was meaningful. I think what we're trying to do right now with our populations, with the justice-involved folks, is to make sure that there's some relevance in that pathway, and that it's a short-term certificate that they can earn something that gets them in the door, with an industry partner. And then as we go on, also stress the importance of additional educational attainment. So if they get a certificate in industrial maintenance and they can get a job at a local industry provider, then we make sure that we encourage them to get the associate degree, and then they go on and get a bachelor's degree and continue furthering that education. And also looking at prior learning assessment. Does somebody come to us with a skill set or a certification that we can bring in as college credit, so that then it helps them get done with a certificate or a degree in a quicker time frame?
Absolutely. That prior learning assessment, I'm sure, is essential when you're looking at, shorter time frames, but larger outcomes. So thank you for that, Jeff. Artie, do you have any thoughts you want to add to that particular question?
Well, I'll just say that I think the pathways to post-secondary is obviously very key, but we cannot forget that about 80% of the folks who are involved don't have a high school equivalency or have some other issue that is preventing them from enrolling. So we need to deal with some of those. I actually just wrote an op-ed on this. We need to deal with some of those other contributing factors before we can even talk about this pathway we can create for them in post-secondary. Don't get me wrong, post-secondary is critical and important to support, but it can't be the only thing we do, because we'll leave a whole bunch of folks behind.
And if you want to share that op-ed with us, Artie, we'd be happy to include that in the email. So, all right, Kylie, anything you want to add?
Just to quickly bounce off what they were saying. I think that a lot of folks that weren't successful in completing high school or completing post-secondary before aren't necessarily going to be a good fit for traditional classrooms. And so the minute that you're doing something that's competency-based, where you can learn kind of as you start to understand the concepts, that's going to be helpful. And then incorporating that like employment-based skills that makes something like mathematics a lot more relevant to someone it gives them a different view into the types of education than they had when they were in traditional school and maybe weren't being didn't have a lot of success with that. So I'm happy that to see that like the folks on this call are pursuing some of those non-traditional ways of connecting folks to education to make them more successful.
Absolutely. Good point, Kylie. All right. Next question from Ken is, what is the best practice approach to overcome the negative image of offenders seeking employment with private sector employers? And I'm going to add a piece onto this as a kind of real world example, and maybe you all can address this one in particular. In my previous life as an economic developer, we had a major company come in. They had hundreds of job openings. They had a lot of justice involved population applying for positions. The company couldn't fill the positions, but didn't want to fill the positions with these particular individuals. So how can workforce boards, education institutions, and just professionals involved in this particular system help to overcome those particular negative images?
I'm going to talk from an employer perspective for a minute, because I think at APDS, 15% of our workforce is formerly incarcerated. And while we do background checks on employees, they go through a traditional interview process like we would do with anybody else. We ask them at the background check process to just disclose anything that we would find, and we accept that. If they're obviously holding information back or we've discovered something else, that can be an issue. But in general, the folks who are involved in the criminal justice system really want to be employed, and they are grateful for the opportunities. And when folks like Jeff train them, they're no different. We don't treat folks who are involved in the criminal justice system any different than we do any of our other employees. We do, however, offer some additional assistance if they have other needs. So we have done things like loan employees money to get an apartment or something like that. So I think that is something that employers need to consider. In general, we've never had an issue. And I will say it is wrong of us as a country, because I think, as Kylie noted earlier, we have people who can become productive tax-paying citizens and who want to. And if we don't allow that into our communities, what are we doing? We're not a second chance country then.
Good point, Artie.
Yeah, I think, reducing the level of judgment against people sometimes, because, we all get to where we are walking different paths and having different challenges, and I think about, kind of an old, maybe spiritual saying, but for the grace of God, go I. I know if I was held to a standard of things I'd done in high school, I wouldn't be sitting as a chancellor of Ivy Tech Community College right now. And I'm always grateful that there wasn't cell phones and video cameras and social media back in my young days. So, and so those challenges are there, and people can come into the system for many, many, many different reasons. And understanding that, we like to give people chances here, and kind of like Artie said, we expect honesty, and setting expectations, and let's talk through it, and let's just understand it, and let's get to a place together. But, reducing some of that judgment, we seem to be a lot more willing to do against others instead of, I always tell people, we have some folks who say, I'm not going to handhold somebody clear through their educational experience. And I'll say, I'll hold their hand clear across that graduation stage if I have to.
Yeah. And I would just add, employers put other criteria on folks who are involved in the criminal justice system. They can't have murdered somebody. They can't have, and I will say, we have a board member, 27 years incarcerated. We have for a violent crime. We have folks who have killed people on our staff. And there is a stigma associated. And oftentimes it's when that person was very young, to Jeff's point, right? They were young. They were offered an opportunity to turn their lives around, and they did. And then we need to give them pathways to continue on that journey.
Anyone here who is a part of the workforce development system, a local workforce board, would probably remember that like 5 years ago, you had to go out to companies and make the case for why they should hire vulnerable populations, whether it was, youth, out of school youth, reentry justice. Now they may not be coming to you asking, how do I hire this particular population of people, but they are coming to you and asking how they can hire more people, period. And so this really is kind of an opportune time to have these conversations with employers, and sometimes in a one-on-one setting where you can really have them thinking critically about why they're setting standards the way that they are and whether or not those are helping or hurting their chances of having like a successful talent recruitment strategy. So things to help encourage folks to think about are the types of felonies or misdemeanors that are actually going to pose harm to the company without writing off, or setting a bar that maybe doesn't necessarily make sense, just, no felonies at all or nothing within the last 5 years. And then consider what the individual has accomplished during the time of incarceration and since, because those are two really big barriers to overcome. And it says a lot about someone's character to be able to get to a point where they're sitting in front of you in an interview and talking intelligently about what they think that they can offer for your company. It says a lot about what they've been able to overcome during that time. And then of course, giving folks soft skills and technical qualifications that are going to make it harder for employers to say no, just based on criminal history alone.
Those are excellent points, Kylie. I feel like that alone could be a 101 for most chambers of commerce even, right? I know there's all over the news all the time lately. We can't find enough employees. We can't find enough workers. But, a lot of people, they're not talking about those type of things and how there is this whole population sitting right in front of you. But those are great points, Kylie. Thank you. We have one more question from the Q&A portion that I'm going to ask the group just briefly, and then we'll get back to the regularly scheduled programming, if you will. So besides the tangible employment and training products and pathways that are developed and offered, how is trauma being integrated as a holistic and sustainable strategy to assist with strengthening the reintegration, retention, and talent development of the justice involved?
I think, Jeff, you should talk about your, and then I'll get into mine because I think you have a great answer there.
Well, I hope so. And if not, remind me of our recent discussions. But it's trauma it drives so much. And I was having a conversation with some funders this morning about the trauma that's been put on folks, particularly those early childhood age folks over the last couple of years with some of the decisions that adults make through all of this. And trauma drives so much. And, and I think about a lot of what we're talking about is rehabilitation, but we can't even begin to rehabilitate those that haven't been habilitated in the first place, and so I think as we're looking at those wraparound services and how we provide that additional support that people need to be successful, restorative justice is based upon a model of getting folks around who are close to that individual who can have an impact, whether it's an uncle, a family member, a former coach, whomever it may be that can help them stay on the right track and on the right path. And the more we can keep folks occupied, particularly in those early stages as they're trying to break free from, some issues that they face, because we all have trauma in our lives, and it impacts our day-to-day decision. I lost my oldest daughter a few years ago due to the opioid epidemic, and my children are successful and in the helping field. But the things that impact us can impact all of us, and it can impact all families. And we've got to give grace sometimes and understand we just get to where we are for a variety of reasons. And the more we can wrap people with, I don't want to sound too flowery, but love and support and respect and value, then we can bring people on to better our communities.
Yeah, I think I would just add to that a couple of points. So when folks become involved in the criminal justice system, what they really experience, and we've talked to many folks, is a shutdown. They cannot take in information and they cannot really communicate information because they are so shocked by what they're experiencing, because incarceration itself is trauma, right? And so we have to help them open their minds up to understanding that they have alternative pathways. So we spend a lot of time developing programs that sort of get at that issue. So we have a new program we just launched called the Master Plan, based on a book by our director of engagement about his involvement in the criminal justice system. So we create that, and then you wrap that with, as Jeff said, these cognitive behavioral therapy programs. You have to deal with breaking free from substance abuse. You have to deal with sort of all the mental health issues that come with incarceration, and those have to be sustainable. So it's why we use technology, but we also partner with our institutions so that they understand they can leverage that technology and somebody can do it on their own. And we see a lot of usage of our technology at 10, 11, 12 p.m. because they're trying to settle their minds. And then you partner that with the institution who is delivering the in-person part of that. So you want to create this holistic approach.
Those insights into when your devices are being used, Artie, those are really, I'm sure, valuable when you're thinking about the mental health of those who are involved in the system. And, one of the things I want to point out that you all both touched on was the fact that, we talk about employers doing things differently for justice-involved populations. And while it certainly is important and is a very unique population, we can often look to what employers are already doing and what nonprofits are already doing with other at-risk populations or marginalized populations. And I will just bring up, 11 or 12 years ago, and when the veteran population was such a hot topic, people were talking consistently about PTSD and what role the employer could play in making sure that things were set up for success for that particular veteran. And I just look at some of those similarities for how employers can set all of their populations up for success by sometimes using the best practices from, previously learned situations. So, Kylie, I think you had made a little bit of a comment based on one of the things that we saw come through in the chat about the federal programs. Do you want to add to that a little bit?
Yeah. So a lot of times in maybe an economy where employers aren't so desperate for talent, employers kind of want some kind of incentive to be able to hire someone that they see as a potential risk. And so someone did bring up the federal bonding program that can help provide a little bit of financial incentive and kind of leverage in case things do, not work out for some reason. And so that's something that business services representatives in workforce development and HR professionals or, economic development professionals can become more familiar with, so that they can make that pitch to employers as well, as something that they can use to help hire and receive some financial assistance as well.
All good things. And I think these are great examples too of some of the resources that we can provide in the follow-up email that we send out. There were two direct questions to our panelists. So I'm going to start off. Actually, there was one for Jeff earlier. And so real quick, hang on, let me get back to that. Somebody asked specifically if you could talk a little bit more about the Work Matters program, Jeff. Oh, you're on mute.
You'd think after 18 months we'd all have that.
Okay. Yeah, we all do it. We all do it.
It again, as I alluded to earlier, it came from a discussion from some of our employers who were just in desperate need of getting folks in the pipeline and trying to figure out, and some of the question was, why can't people just want a job? Why can't they come to work on time? Why can't they just pull themselves up by the bootstrap? And having some discussions about trauma and why people, through generational poverty may make different decisions. And so Work Matters Group started with 3 employers in the community that hire a lot of folks, as well as our chamber board president and us as Ivy Tech, and really kind of coming together to have some discussions about, one, what we can do for short term, get some people in the door right away. Then how can we develop some additional pipeline? And so we've got some ideas there. And then also, how do we bring advanced manufacturing and those skill sets into elementary and in middle school so that folks become engaged. And so we did a billboard campaign, and we have premier partners. And so we hire local Ivy Tech grads. And so there are a number of local employers that are on there. We also we require partners to pay at least $15 an hour to be engaged with us, so that there's got to be some meaningful and livable wages as we're trying to partner and build skill sets. So it's really been productive. We're getting ready to roll out some other initiatives that is going to work on some students who graduate from high school that don't have any plan, that may have ended up in the criminal justice system or justice involved. We're trying to do some things now with pretrial release programs. And so in lieu of posting a bond through a bail bondsman, but maybe there's pretrial conditions so that we can work with that population to get them skilled up. So the Work Matters group, and it kind of is a play on work matters, and that there are matters involved with work. So I guess I'm not an English major, but maybe a noun and a verb in there both. And so, it's really been a wonderful initiative to get folks engaged and to really get employers to understand, because one of the things that we have going on right now is one of our employers, their downtime is on Fridays. And so they let their employees come to us to get the education on Fridays. So they're getting paid to work, and they're coming to us then to get that educational component. And it's also having that discussion with employers to say, can you not put them on, change their shifts, or can we keep them on a shift until we can get them through the educational component? So a lot of times it's just as simple as communication.
Well, and it sounds like some amazing ingenuity and collaboration. I'm looking at your Walt Disney quote and thinking everything that you just talked about really is kind of that curious and curiosity leading the way to new paths. That's really great stuff, Jeff. Artie, somebody had asked if you could briefly share an example of the transcript that you referred to earlier. Is that something that you can explain, or would it be better to email that?
So I can email that. It's actually why I think it's important, though, and different from a resume, is it shows effort and then has a recommendation directly on it, depending on if that person has received one. And so from an employer perspective, you get a totally different perspective on that person than you would. And we've heard, by the way, from many employers that the hard skills are much less important than the soft skills and the involvement in the rehabilitational side of things.
Okay, good points. Well, our final question was supposed to be about the untapped talent pool that we have here and how employers should approach this. But I think we've already kind of delved into that as much as we need to at this point. So having no other questions right now from the audience, I'm going to ask our panelists to give just a kind of a brief closing thoughts with kind of a kicker at the end of it. We have a lot of people who still have a lot of ARP money trying to figure out what to do with it. So if you could wrap things up in a little bit of a non-traditional way, provide whatever closing comments or thoughts that you have based on the questions and the comments that have been made, but then add that closing comment about if you had some ARP money, how would you spend it, and how would you put things to use in the most imaginative way? So Artie, we'll start off with you.
Oh, I always get the hard ones first.
I know, sorry.
I think sort of there's a couple things to think about here. One, education lifts all boats, but we need to think about education in a way that amplifies, because a lot of folks involved in the criminal justice system just don't have that opportunity to get involved in educational programs because they have limited classroom space, they have limited teachers. So from an employer perspective, if I had a magic wand, I would require anybody who has involvement in the criminal justice system to have an individualized assessment and then pathway created for them. And I would match that to a delivery mechanism that allowed them to have an individualized approach, but with data. And I think, if we spent our money preventing people from going back in the system and creating those connections to employment, we would, as a country, I think, lift all boats. Because remember, it's not just the people who are involved in the system, it's their families that are impacted. And if you have one person who's incarcerated, their kids are much more likely to be incarcerated.
Absolutely. Those are such great points, especially when you think of it from the holistic family standpoint. And I'm going to even go a step further and say, and I bet Jeff would agree with this, if we could keep them from going to prison in general, right? Like more K through 12 programs, and then, do that back end piece with what you're talking about, Artie, I think that we would really be making some impact in this particular community. So how about you, Jeff? Closing thoughts and magic ARP funds.
Yeah. I used to tell my probation officer, our ultimate goal is to be out of a job.
Exactly.
And I told a consultant many months ago, how do you know what you're doing is working? And I'm like, when we don't need a 500-bed jail. Jails and prisons are valuable. We need to be safe, and our communities need to be safe. And not everyone can be saved, but everyone deserves a chance to be saved. And I think our strategies need to revolve around stopping the revolving door of the criminal justice system. Our criminal justice system should not be the growth industry in our communities. And I think, with what we're trying to do and looking at a full continuum of pretrial, eliminate bail bondsmen. And sorry if there's any bail bondsmen out there, but there are other ways to do these things without taking money from communities that can least afford dollars to be taken away from. And then also to make sure we stay with people, as they go through the system. Consequences can be therapeutic. And as if somebody's on a pretrial and they violate conditions, then they may need to go sit in jail. And that's where I think what we're able to do with hopefully some partnerships with Artie and her software and her programming is, even if somebody has to go sit in jail for a couple weeks, they don't have to lose out on their education, or they don't have to lose out on that training and that pathway they're on. And so I think I would look at using some of those dollars to really be able to invest in getting folks to a better place. A lot of times that's wraparound services. We just here locally tapped into some, what we call our HERF dollars, the higher education dollars, to be able, as students are coming back and struggling with the reintegration back in face-to-face, to make sure that we had mental health counseling on campus. And we've just posted a director of mental health and counseling so that we can engage with folks so that when they're struggling, we can still keep those services wrapped around them and keep that network of support going. So really kind of I would use it to invest in the ability to keep people supported through this process and make sure that finances or lack of finances aren't the barrier, or lack of opportunities not the barrier. And it's just really a matter of working with those individuals to get them to a career, to a meaningful job. And then we'll see that generational poverty slowly start declining. We didn't get here overnight, and we're not going to get out of it overnight. So it's just going to take time, investment, commitment, patience, which I'm not very good at, but having that and a little bit of empathy, a little more empathy. And we can't buy that. And I'm just not sure the ARP dollars are going to be able to purchase empathy, but we could all use a little more of that.
And
Jeff.
That was excellent. I would say, just to draw a contrast, think about the cost of incarceration. It's $65,000, $70,000 a year. How are we investing that money when the vast majority of people who go through our criminal justice system don't get programming?
No, great points. Absolutely. And, this is, I want to say, the third or fourth time that the term wraparound services has been used. So obviously there is a and something that we should obviously continue to bring forward for some of our audience members. Just briefly, Kylie, before you give your closing thoughts, one of the comments that Jeff made, where I felt like we all had like praise hands going on. The consequences should be therapeutic, right? And not a life sentence. And I do think that it is incumbent upon, those of us who are involved in workforce economic development and whatnot to, help to bring this population to the forefront and get them back to work. So it isn't a life sentence. It is more about, you did your time. These opportunities should now be available to you like everybody else. All right, Kylie, closing thoughts and art magic, sprinkle some art dust on it.
I won't try to be too political. I was just going to say that find out what's currently working in your communities and make it better. So that's like the really easy answer. And then another one is if you've ever dreamed of doing an innovative program and helping a specific population that's just generally been really hard to tap into, why not do it right now? Because this opportunity may not come around in the next, 10, 20 years. So be innovative, be creative now. When I think about find out what's working in your community and try to make it better, I'm thinking of the types of community organizations that are doing really good work. And what could they do better? How could they serve this population or a youth population or people with mental health issues and substance abuse problems better if they had additional resources? Or if they could get earlier access to people who have those barriers as they're coming out of a system like Reentry. So it's really an opportunity to give those folks more resources to be able to do things that they wouldn't normally be able to do. Try and get connected and create new strategic partnerships and pathways so that the first time a probation officer is talking with a case manager at a community center isn't when someone's, having an issue and like has violated probation, that they're talking about it beforehand. And so that involves a little bit of creativity and a lot of planning and implementation. So now's the time to get that done.
Absolutely. We did a webinar over the summer. I want to say it was in June about braided funding. That is available on our YouTube if anybody wants to go back and look at it. But I bring that up to say that, one of our employees, Roy Vanderford, I'm going to call him out. He jokes around a lot that workforce organizations are consistently complaining about all of the different regulations and the lack of funding and all of the things that prevent them from being able to be creative. And now when we have more money than we have ever seen in our lives, everybody's like, I don't know what to do with the money. So, it's kind of like everything that you've been complaining about, everything that you wanted to have on your wish list, now is the time to be creative and implement it and to reach out to those local community partners, like an Artie, like a Jeff, like a Kylie, to look at how you can put together something more robust, because it's really going to be better together than trying to do things on our own. And so if people need ideas for some of those braided funding opportunities, they can go to our YouTube. And I think we actually do bring that up a little bit throughout the course of that particular webinar. So I want to thank our panelists for all of the thoughtful ideas and insight, motivation, frankly, to really help this population out. We will, as I mentioned before, be sending some follow-up emails and information. So if you all have questions that were not answered during the panel, I am sure that our panelists would be happy to help dive into that a little bit more if you have specific questions for them or just as a whole for the group. So again, I want to thank you all for your time and just really appreciate the thoughtful feedback.
Thank you.
All right.
Everyone.
Take care.